Welcome to Sacred Stories. Today, we will explore one of the most iconic narratives in the Bible, the 10 Plagues of Egypt. These plagues were not just demonstrations of God's power but also a direct response to Pharaoh's stubbornness in refusing to free the Israelites from slavery. Each plague was carefully sent to confront the false Egyptian deities, challenge Pharaoh's authority, and show that the Lord alone is God. Get ready to dive into a story of faith, challenges, and liberation, filled with profound meanings and timeless lessons. Have you ever wondered what really happened with the 10 plagues of Egypt? How could such devastating events transform an entire nation and free a people enslaved for centuries? Today, on Sacred Stories, we will dive into this fascinating biblical narrative and explore every detail of the plagues that not only challenged Pharaoh but also confronted Egypt's gods and demonstrated the absolute power of the God of Israel. At the height of its glory, Egypt was the most powerful empire of its time, with a deeply religious culture and an economy built on the enslavement of the Israelites. Pharaoh was regarded as a living god, and his power seemed unchallengeable. However, the Israelites, descendants of Jacob, cried out to God for deliverance after centuries of oppression. In response, God chose Moses and Aaron to confront Pharaoh. The purpose of the 10 plagues was twofold: to demonstrate that the Lord was the one true God and to free his people from bondage. With his heart hardened, Pharaoh refused to obey God, and thus the plagues began. Water turned to blood. The first plague directly attacked the heart of Egypt, the Nile River. This river was not only a source of water but also the foundation of Egypt's economy, agriculture, and religion. Following God's command, Moses struck the river with his staff, and the water turned to blood, Exodus 7 verses 14 to 24. The Nile symbolized fertility and was associated with the god Hapi, revered as the provider of life. However, the river became a source of death. Fish died, and the river emitted an unbearable stench. All the water in Egypt, including wells and reservoirs, was affected. Pharaoh's magicians attempted to replicate the miracle but failed to reverse the disaster. Despite the devastation, Pharaoh remained obstinate and refused to let the Israelites go. The Plague of Frogs. The second plague brought an overwhelming number of frogs to Egypt, Exodus 8 verses 1 to 15. They emerged from the Nile and invaded homes, bedrooms, ovens, and even the Egyptians' beds. What was once seen as a sacred symbol of the goddess Hecate, associated with fertility and childbirth, became a curse. The excessive presence of frogs disrupted daily life, causing disgust and chaos. When the frogs died, their carcasses piled up, spreading a terrible stench across the land. Pharaoh asked Moses to intercede so the frogs would disappear, but once his request was granted, he hardened his heart again. The Plague of Gnats. The third plague directly targeted the environment and the ritual purity of the Egyptians. The dust of the earth was turned into gnats that infested both people and animals, Exodus 8 verses 16 to 19. The Egyptians, especially priests, prided themselves on their high standards of cleanliness and constant purification rituals. Geb, the god of the earth, was challenged as even the sacred soil could not escape divine intervention. This time, Pharaoh's magicians were unable to replicate the miracle and acknowledged it as the finger of God. Still, Pharaoh refused to listen. The Plague of Flies. The fourth plague brought swarms of flies that invaded homes, streets, and palaces, making life unbearable, Exodus 8 verses 20 to 32. However, the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived, was miraculously spared, showing God's ability to protect his people amidst chaos. Kepri, the god of insects and creation, was humiliated. The flies spread diseases, disrupted daily activities, and made it impossible to live comfortably in any inhabited space. Pharaoh once again asked Moses for relief but reneged on his promise to free the Israelites once the flies were gone. The death of livestock. The fifth plague was a devastating disease that struck Egypt's livestock, Exodus 9 verses 1 to 7. Cattle, camels, sheep, and goats perished throughout Egypt, while the Israelites' animals remained unharmed. Apis, the sacred bull, symbolizing strength, fertility, and power, was powerless against this plague. Egypt's economy, heavily reliant on livestock, took a critical hit. Yet, Pharaoh's heart remained hardened, and he continued to deny God's power. Stay tuned to explore the remaining plagues that transformed Egypt and brought freedom to God's people. The Plague of Boils. The sixth plague brought direct physical suffering. Painful boils broke out on the skin of the Egyptians and their animals, Exodus 9 verses 8 to 12. Following God's command, Moses took ashes from a furnace and tossed them into the air before Pharaoh. These ashes spread throughout Egypt, turning into festering sores on all people and creatures. This plague was a direct challenge to the Egyptian gods of health and healing, such as Sekhmet, the goddess of healing, and Thoth, the god of wisdom and medicine. Even the Egyptian priests, who performed rituals to secure divine protection, could not escape the boils. Pharaoh's magicians, who had previously tried to replicate the plagues, couldn't even stand before Moses due to their pain. Despite the humiliation and suffering, Pharaoh's heart remained hardened, and he refused to release the Israelites. The Plague of Hail. The seventh plague unleashed an unprecedented storm upon Egypt. Hail mixed with fire rained down, destroying crops, livestock in the open fields, and injuring anyone who didn't seek shelter, Exodus 9 verses 13 to 35. Moses warned Pharaoh of the impending disaster, giving the Egyptians a chance to protect their servants and animals, but many ignored the warning. This plague directly challenged Nut, the goddess of the sky, and Set, the god of storms. It was a clear reminder that only God controlled the heavens and natural phenomena. While Egypt faced widespread devastation, the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived, remained untouched. Terrified by the storm's might, Pharaoh begged Moses to intercede and promised to release the Israelites. However, as soon as the hail stopped, he hardened his heart once more, refusing to let them go. The Plague of Locusts. The eighth plague brought swarms of locusts that invaded Egypt and devoured everything left after the hailstorm, Exodus 10 verses 1 to 20. They covered the skies, turning day into night, and completely consumed the fields, trees, and any vegetation that remained. The locusts represented a direct attack on Serapis, the god who protected the harvests. Hunger and despair began to spread throughout Egypt, and Pharaoh's own advisors pleaded with him to relent, as the country was being destroyed. Despite the outcry of his people, Pharaoh asked Moses to remove the locusts. Yet, once the plague was lifted, he hardened his heart again and refused to let the Israelites go. The Plague of Darkness. The ninth plague was a direct display of power against one of Egypt's primary deities, Ra, the sun god. Dense darkness covered Egypt for 3 days, so thick that no one could see or move, Exodus 10 verses 21 to 29. The sunlight, vital to life in Egypt and central to Ra's worship, was completely taken away. Only the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived, remained in light. This profound darkness symbolized God's sovereignty over creation and the false gods of Egypt, showing that control of the universe was not in Ra's hands or Pharaoh's but in the hands of the Lord. Even so, Pharaoh refused to free the Israelites, even threatening Moses with death if he returned. The death of the firstborn. The 10th and final plague was the most devastating. God declared that, on that night, every firstborn in Egypt would die, from Pharaoh's son, considered a god, to the firstborn of the humblest servant, as well as the firstborn of animals, Exodus 11:1, 12:30. The Israelites were given detailed instructions to protect themselves. Each family was to sacrifice a lamb without blemish and mark their doorposts with the lamb's blood. The angel of death would pass through Egypt but would spare the homes marked with the blood, symbolizing obedience and faith. That night, wailing echoed throughout Egypt as no Egyptian household was spared from loss. Pharaoh, defeated and devastated by the death of his own son, commanded the Israelites to leave immediately, taking their families and belongings. This final plague not only secured the freedom of God's people but also marked the beginning of the Passover celebration, an eternal reminder of God's faithfulness and power to protect and redeem his people. The 10 plagues of Egypt were more than displays of power. They were judgments against Egypt's false gods, challenges to Pharaoh's authority, and a path to the liberation of the Israelites. Each plague revealed God's supremacy over creation, human religions, and earthly powers. These events not only transformed Israel's history but also delivered an eternal message about the power of obedience, faith, and divine justice. Have you ever reflected on the profound meaning behind these plagues? Share your thoughts and continue following us here at Sacred Stories to discover more about the stories that have shaped faith and humanity.